TDS on payment to contractor, section 194C. This section basically deals with payments which are made to certain contractor who carry out what is known as work. Now, what is the meaning of work? That is something we will discuss as a part of this particular discussion. Generally, if it is work, then it's covered under 194C. One important difference which you should make is payment for work or other stuff which we are going to discuss will be covered here. Payment for professional or technical services will be covered under section 194J. So therefore, when you understand this section, you should try and understand what's the difference between these two. Because here the TDS rate might be 1 or 2%. In this case, the TDS rate is 10%. Let's look at this particular section. So the first question is, which are the parties which are involved in a transaction? Of course, there is a payer, the person who makes the payment, and there is a recipient. Now, the person who is making the payment can either be a resident or he can be a non-resident. The good thing is both are covered under section 194C, which means if a payer who is a resident makes a payment of the nature which is covered under section 194C, he has to deduct TDS. Similarly, if there's a non-resident who is covered under section 194C and he makes a payment, he also has to deduct TDS. Now, the second question is, who would be the recipient? So if the recipient is a resident, he is covered under section 194C, which means where a resident makes payment to another resident, that's covered under 194C. If a non-resident makes payment to a resident, even that may be covered under section 194C, subject to certain conditions. We will discuss those later. But when the recipient is a non-resident, which means that if a resident is making a payment to a non-resident or a non-resident is making payment to another non-resident, that is covered under section 195. So even if the nature of payment is something which is covered under section 194C, if the recipient is a non-resident, section 194C does not apply, but section 195 will be applicable. So who would be the recipient? Now, when we talk about a resident, a recipient can be an individual or HUF or a person other than individual or HUF. So other than individual or HUF will cover limited liability partnership, company, right, and any other assessee who is not an individual or an HUF. If the recipient is an individual or an HUF, the TDS shall be deducted by the payer at the rate of 1% of the amount. So if a resident makes a payment to an individual amounting to 1 lakh, which is covered under section 194C, the TDS will be 1000. And when would the TDS be deducted? It would be deducted at the time of payment or credit, whichever is earlier. So if you give an advance without the amount actually becoming due, then at the time of making the advance, you have to deduct TDS. If you receive the invoice and credit the account of the party or even a suspense account, you have to deduct TDS. The earlier of two has to be considered, and the same amount cannot be considered twice for deduction. What I mean is, suppose you receive an invoice of 50,000 on, let's say, 1st July. You make the payment on 30th July for this amount. If you have deducted the TDS at the time of credit, you need not deduct TDS again at the time of payment. So to summarize, if the recipient is an individual or an HUF, the TDS has to be 1% and has to be deducted at the time of payment or credit, whichever is earlier. But if the recipient is a person other than an individual or HUF, the TDS should be deducted by the payer at 2% at payment or credit, whichever is earlier. Now, like I said, the recipient here has to be a resident only, because if the recipient is a non-resident, it is not covered under section 194C. The second condition is that even when these conditions are satisfied, the payment that is made should be above the minimum exemption threshold. What this means is that if a person A makes a payment to a person B, right, there is an exemption that if the total payment, and we are going to discuss this in detail, if the payment does not exceed a specified threshold, then no TDS is required to be deducted.